ex-husband laughed when he saw my invitation and asked whether I had finally decided to find myself a rich husband. He said it loudly enough for the registration staff to hear, and the woman standing beside him, the same woman who had once called herself my best friend, gave a soft little laugh as if she'd been waiting all evening for her cue. I smiled, handed my invitation to the young woman at the registration table, and said nothing. What neither of them knew was that I hadn't come to that gala looking for a wealthy man, a second marriage, or anyone's approval. I had been working behind the scenes for nearly a year to help save the organization hosting that event, and by the end of the night, my ex-husband was going to discover that the woman he thought he had left behind was no longer waiting for him to recognize her worth. The gala was being held at the Grand Mercer Hotel in downtown Columbus, and the ballroom was already glowing beneath enormous crystal chandeliers when I arrived at 6:38 p.m. I wore a simple dark blue dress I'd bought during a clearance sale, and the pearl earrings my mother had left me. They were the only things I had chosen because they mattered rather than because they looked impressive. My shoes, unfortunately, were another story. They had seemed elegant in the store. After 15 minutes of standing, they felt like instruments of torture. I was considering whether it would be socially acceptable to remove them before dinner when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Well, look who decided to come." I turned and saw Rick. My ex-husband looked exactly like the version of himself he liked people to see: expensive tuxedo, silver beginning at his temples, confident smile, one hand resting casually on the arm of Melissa Grant. Melissa had been my closest friend for almost 20 years. She knew my mother's favorite flower, my daughter's first word, the password to my old Wi-Fi, and exactly how I took my coffee. She also knew precisely how much my marriage had meant to me. Now she stood beside my former husband wearing a burgundy gown and looking at me like I was an unexpected guest at my own funeral. Melissa smiled first. "Claire, I didn't realize you were coming." Her tone was warm enough to fool anyone who didn't know her. I had spent 2 decades knowing her. I recognized the difference between kindness and performance. Rick looked down at the invitation in my hand and chuckled. "Here to find yourself a rich husband." Melissa laughed again. I felt the old instinct rise inside me. 6 months earlier, I would have answered. I would have explained that I could support myself. I would have reminded him that the invitation had my name printed on it. I might even have said something cruel enough to ruin his evening. Instead, I handed the invitation to the registration attendant. "Good evening," I said. The young woman scanned the code, frowned, and scanned it again. For a second, I wondered whether Rick had somehow been right. Maybe my invitation wasn't valid. Maybe someone had made a mistake. Then the attendant looked toward the ballroom, reached for the radio clipped to her jacket, and quietly said, "Please tell Mr. Mercer that Claire Bennett has arrived." Rick's smile disappeared. Melissa stopped laughing. I looked at them and almost smiled. Almost. Less than a minute later, Daniel Mercer appeared from the ballroom. He was 68, silver-haired, and the kind of businessman who didn't need to announce his accomplishments because everyone else already knew them. He crossed the lobby directly toward me, ignored the dozen people waiting to greet him, and opened his arms. "Claire, you made it." He hugged me like someone he'd genuinely been expecting. Rick stared. Daniel stepped back and held my shoulders. "I need 5 minutes upstairs before dinner." I nodded. "Is something wrong?" His expression changed slightly. "I'm afraid there might be." He gestured toward an event coordinator. "Take Claire to the small conference room. I'll meet you there." As I followed the coordinator toward the elevator, I could feel Rick's eyes on my back. 18 months earlier, that feeling would have mattered to me. I would have imagined him wondering what he had lost. I would have wanted him to feel jealous, confused, maybe even regretful. But divorce had taught me something strange. You can spend years wanting someone to regret losing you and still discover that the moment they finally do, it doesn't feel like winning. The elevator doors closed, and the ballroom disappeared behind me. I stared at my reflection in the mirrored wall and remembered the woman I had been when I first met Rick. I was 24. He was 27. He owned an old pickup truck that sometimes refused to start in cold weather, had 3 decent shirts, and had recently started a small construction company with 1 employee and a phone number that was still written on a scrap of paper. I helped him build the business. I kept the books at our kitchen table. I typed invoices after our daughter Emily went asleep. I answered calls while making dinner. I sat through meetings with suppliers and bankers. When Rick couldn't attend something, I went. When he needed numbers, I found them. When he needed someone to remember birthdays, client preferences, children's names, and which supplier's wife had just undergone surgery, I remembered. Rick worked hard. I never denied that. He built Bennett Construction into a successful regional company. But somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing the difference between building something himself and building something alone. By the time our company had 30 employees and projects across Central Ohio, I had become invisible inside the life I helped create. Rick introduced me at events as my wife, Claire, and somehow that became the entirety of my professional identity. Then came Melissa. She had been beside me through my mother's illness. She had slept on my couch when I was afraid to be alone. She had listened to me cry about my marriage. That was what made the betrayal so devastating. Rick didn't betray a stranger. Melissa didn't betray someone she barely knew. They both knew exactly where to place the knife because I had spent years telling them where it hurt. Our divorce became final after months of arguments, lawyers, financial statements, and conversations I never thought I'd have with a man I once expected to grow old beside. The separation agreement was fair. I received my portion of our assets, a modest inheritance from my mother, and enough money to know I wouldn't be homeless. But being financially okay wasn't the same thing as knowing what came next. I was 51, and the last time I'd had a conventional full-time job, my daughter was still learning multiplication tables. My first few interviews were humiliating. One manager looked at my resume and said, "So, you've been out of the workforce for nearly 2 decades." I smiled and said, "Not exactly." He didn't understand. I didn't blame him. People see gaps on paper. They don't see the mornings you wake before everyone else, the payroll you fix after midnight, the vendor who gets paid because you caught an accounting mistake, or the thousands of invisible decisions that keep a household and a business moving. Eventually, a dentist named Dr. Patel hired me 3 days a week to help with billing and bookkeeping. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but the first paycheck felt enormous. I sat in my car holding it in both hands. My name was printed on it. Nobody else's. It was one of the smallest moments of my life and somehow one of the most important. Around the same time, I began volunteering at Franklin Family House, a nonprofit that provided temporary housing and support for families whose children were receiving medical treatment in Columbus. My sister had once depended on a similar organization when her son was sick, and I remembered what it meant to have a clean room, breakfast, and someone telling you where to find a washing machine when your entire world had narrowed to a hospital room. At Franklin, nobody cared who Rick Bennett was. Nobody knew about the divorce. They didn't care that I had once attended business dinners with people whose names appeared in newspapers. They simply asked me to fold towels, answer phones, check families in, and restock food. I liked being useful without being important. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, I noticed something in a construction budget. Franklin was planning a major expansion, and Daniel Mercer was leading the fundraising campaign. The preliminary budget was enormous, nearly $5 million. While sorting invoices, I noticed 2 electrical estimates that appeared to include the same labor category. I pointed it out to Daniel. He checked the numbers, went silent, then looked at me. "How did you catch that?" I shrugged. I was married to a contractor for 26 years. Eventually, construction numbers become part of your brain. He laughed. But after that day, he began asking me to attend planning meetings. At first, I resisted. Then he told me something that stayed with me. "Claire, you don't need permission to be useful." Over the next year, I became deeply involved in the fundraising campaign. I helped review budgets. I introduced Daniel to business owners I had known through Rick's old professional circles. I remembered which donors cared about children's health care and which wanted measurable results. I helped secure a $1 million matching pledge. I personally committed $100,000 over 3 years from my own finances. I didn't want my name on a wall. I didn't want a plaque. I didn't want Daniel announcing my contribution. I wanted one thing in my life that had nothing to do with Rick Bennett. Then Bennett Construction submitted a bid for part of the expansion. The moment I saw the company name, I told Daniel I was stepping away from anything connected to the procurement process. I signed a formal conflict disclosure. I stopped attending those meetings. I saw no pricing. I reviewed no bids. I didn't even ask who was leading. I wanted the organization protected, and I wanted myself protected. 2 weeks before the gala, I ran into Melissa at a coffee shop. She stirred her drink slowly and said, "Rick feels very confident about the Franklin project." I told her I wouldn't know anything about it. She smiled. "Oh, right, you're not involved anymore." Then she leaned closer and whispered, "He knows he's going to win." That sentence bothered me, not because I wanted Rick to lose, because I knew him. After 26 years, I knew the difference between Rick hopping for something and Rick believing he had information nobody else possessed. Still, I let it go, or at least I tried to. Now, standing in that upstairs conference room with Daniel, I discovered why he had asked to see me. He placed a printed letter on the table. It came from Bennett Construction's attorney. I read it once, then again. They weren't directly accusing me of manipulating the bidding process. Instead, the letter raised concerns about whether Franklin had maintained appropriate impartiality given my relationship with one of the bidders. It asked whether I had access to confidential information and whether my involvement in fundraising had influenced procurement. I looked at Daniel. "He's building a story," Daniel nodded. "That's what I'm afraid of. If his company wins, nobody cares about this letter." "Exactly. And if he loses, he gets to say his ex-wife sabotaged him." Daniel leaned back. "That's the problem." For the first time that night, I wasn't thinking about Rick's insult at the registration table. I was thinking about Franklin Family House, the families who depended on it, the donors who trusted us, the work I'd spent a year doing because I believed in it. "I should leave," I said. Daniel's expression hardened. "Why?" "Because I don't want this turning into a spectacle. Claire, I'm not asking you to disappear because someone else finds your existence inconvenient." The sentence hit harder than I expected. For years, whenever Rick was uncomfortable, I had adjusted. I softened conversations. I apologized for things I hadn't done. I stayed quiet at dinners. I changed plans. I made myself smaller because peace seemed easier than confrontation. Daniel pointed toward the door. "Go downstairs, eat dinner, let me handle the problem." I smiled despite myself. "You make it sound easy." "No, I make it sound like my problem." So I went downstairs. Rick intercepted me before I reached my table. "What were you doing upstairs?" "Talking to Daniel." "About the bid?" "No." He stepped closer. "Claire, I'm serious." "So am I." Melissa appeared beside him. "Everything okay?" I looked at her. "Everything is fine." Rick's eyes narrowed. "The contract will go where it should go." There it was again. That certainty. I remembered the coffee shop. He knows he's going to win. I sat down for dinner and tried to ignore the feeling that something was coming. At 8:15, Daniel walked onto the stage. He spoke about Franklin's families. He talked about the expansion. Then he announced that the original $1 million matching challenge had been increased to $1.5 million. The ballroom erupted in applause. Then Daniel said, "There's someone here who deserves credit for bringing several of those donors to this organization." My stomach tightened. Daniel looked toward my table. I shook my head slightly. He smiled. He was about to say my name when Susan, Franklin's executive director, rushed onto the stage and whispered something in his ear. Daniel's expression changed instantly. He stepped away from the microphone. Susan came directly toward me. "Claire, I need you upstairs." My heart dropped. We went through a service door into a private hallway. Daniel was already waiting with his phone in his hand. One of our major donors received an email. He showed me the screen. It contained screenshots of internal Franklin correspondence. My name appeared in several places. One message made it look like I had been discussing contractor qualifications. Another appeared to show me asking about project costs, but something was wrong. The dates were missing. The replies were missing. The context was gone. I recognized the emails. "I wrote these months before Bennett submitted its bid." Daniel nodded. "I know." "Then whoever sent this knows that too." Susan looked at me. "That's why we're concerned." The donor had already shown the message to 2 board members. Those people had shown it to others. The rumor had begun moving through the ballroom. I looked through the doorway. Rick was talking to someone at his table. Melissa was holding her phone, then she looked up. Our eyes met. She quickly turned the phone face down. My stomach sank. Daniel caught the change in my expression. "You think it was her?" "I don't know." "Then don't accuse her." I hated that he was right. I went into the restroom instead. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at myself beneath the bright lights. For the first time all evening, I wanted to leave. I pulled out my phone. Emily answered. "Mom, hi, are you okay?" "Of course." There was silence. Then she said, "You always say that." I closed my eyes. She told me she had seen pictures from the gala and knew Dad was there. Then she said something that made me stop breathing for a second. You don't have to keep making Dad sound better for me. I didn't know what to say. I love him, Emily continued. He's my father, but I'm an adult. I can love him and still know when he does something wrong. I sat on the edge of the bench. I was trying to protect you. I know, Mom, but sometimes I think you were protecting him. The words stayed with me long after we hung up. When I returned to the hallway, Susan was waiting. We found the sender. My heart began pounding. Who? She looked at me. Melissa. 10 minutes later, Melissa walked into the conference room. Rick followed her. The moment he saw the printed email on the table, his expression changed. What is this? Susan asked Melissa directly. Did you send this? Melissa crossed her arms. I sent information I thought people had a right to know. Rick stared at her. You did this. I was protecting you. From what? Melissa looked at me. From her. I almost laughed. Melissa, I've spent the entire night trying to stay out of your lives. She shook her head. You've been trying to make Rick look terrible ever since the divorce. I looked at her. I checked in, I ate dinner, I volunteered, I donated money. What exactly did I do to him? She had no answer. Then Rick suddenly said, you had no right to send that. Melissa turned on him. Oh, don't start pretending you're innocent. The room went silent. Rick stared at her. What are you talking about? Melissa looked toward me. Tell her why you were so confident about the bid. Rick's face changed. Daniel leaned forward. What did you do? Rick finally admitted that 2 months earlier he had seen part of a competitor's preliminary pricing spreadsheet through a former estimator. He claimed he hadn't asked for it. Daniel asked, did you photograph it? Rick didn't answer. He had. The room went silent. He insisted the numbers weren't final. Daniel replied, that isn't the point. And suddenly everything made sense. Rick hadn't known about my role at Franklin. He hadn't known how much I had contributed to the campaign. He had only known that his ex-wife was involved with the organization and that his company was competing for a major contract. So he had tried to protect himself. Melissa had taken it further. She had used old emails to make me look corrupt. And now both of them were standing in the same room, watching the story they'd created collapse around them. Daniel stood. The procurement process is suspended. Rick looked at him. Daniel, come on. No, I never used those numbers. You possessed information you had no right to possess. Rick looked at me. Claire, I said nothing. He followed me into the hallway. Please, I stopped. Can we talk? We've talked for 26 years. His shoulders dropped. I didn't know what you were doing here. You could have asked. You wouldn't have told me. You didn't ask. He looked away. Then he said quietly, I thought you hated me. I did. His eyes came back to mine. Then I got busy. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely hurt. Not angry, not defensive, just hurt. Can you talk to Daniel? He asked. I almost smiled. There it was, the old pattern. Rick needed me to fix something. For 26 years, I had been the person who translated his mistakes into softer language. He didn't mean it. He was under pressure. He didn't realize how it sounded. I wasn't doing that anymore. That's between you and the board. He stared at me. What do you want? The answer surprised even me. Nothing. I walked away. The procurement committee eventually decided Bennett Construction could no longer participate in the project. Rick voluntarily withdrew rather than face formal disqualification. There was no screaming, no security guards, no dramatic courtroom scene, just paperwork and consequences. But Daniel still had one problem. The ballroom had heard the rumor. He couldn't pretend nothing had happened, so he returned to the microphone. He explained that the bidding process had been paused because of an integrity concern involving one of the contractors. He didn't name Rick. He didn't name Melissa. He didn't turn the charity gala into a public execution. Then he looked toward me. There's something else I need to say. My heart started beating faster. He explained that one of the people who had helped secure the expanded matching challenge had been working with Franklin for nearly a year. He explained my role, my budget work, my donor connections, my commitment of $100,000, and finally, he explained that I had formally removed myself from the procurement process when Bennett Construction submitted its bid. The room became completely silent. Then Daniel said, Claire Bennett asked us not to announce any of this tonight. People turned toward me. I wanted to disappear. Then an older man stood. Then a woman whose son had stayed at Franklin. Then another volunteer. Applause spread across the ballroom. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't perfect. It was better. It was real. I looked across the room. Rick was standing beside his empty chair, and I saw something I'd wanted to see for years. He finally understood, not what he had lost, not how successful I had become, something simpler. He understood that I had never needed him to make me important. I had simply stopped waiting for him to notice that I already was. After the gala, I went to the parking garage alone. I took off my shoes and sat behind the wheel for almost 10 minutes. I had imagined this moment many times. Rick would see me succeed. Rick would regret Melissa. Rick would realize how much I had contributed. Rick would finally understand. But sitting there in the quiet of my car, I realized something uncomfortable. Every fantasy I had built after the divorce still placed Rick at the center. His regret was supposed to be my victory. That night it was. I started the car. And for the first time in years, I drove home without wondering what Rick thought of me. The independent review took 4 weeks. Franklin's outside counsel examined emails, meeting records, access logs, conflict disclosures, and procurement documents. The conclusion was simple. I had done nothing wrong. I had disclosed my relationship with Bennett Construction. I had recused myself. I had never reviewed the bids. Melissa was removed from volunteer responsibilities because Franklin could no longer trust her with confidential information. Rick's company was excluded from the project because he had possessed another bidder's information. His company survived. His employees kept their jobs. That mattered to me. Those workers hadn't betrayed me. They hadn't cheated anyone. They were simply people trying to earn a living. A few weeks later, Emily visited me. We sat on my balcony drinking coffee. She looked at me and said, "Dad called." My shoulders tightened. "He said you embarrassed him." I started to respond. Then she smiled. "I told him you didn't." I looked at her. She shrugged. "You're allowed to stop explaining him to me, Mom." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. For the first time, I understood what she had been trying to tell me. Protecting someone from the consequences of their choices isn't the same as protecting the people you love. Sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is step aside and let another adult own what they did. Months later, Franklin selected a different contractor. Construction began in the spring. The campaign exceeded its fundraising goal. Daniel eventually convinced me to join Franklin's board. I told him I wasn't interested in having my name on a wall. He laughed. "We'll put it on a broom closet." "Already sponsored." "Of course." Then, one afternoon, I ran into Rick at the grocery store. No tuxedo, no gala, no Melissa, no audience. Just Rick standing in the coffee aisle comparing 2 bags of Colombian roast. He looked at me. "Claire." "Hi," he hesitated. "I've been meaning to apologize." I waited. He looked uncomfortable. Then he said, "I underestimated you." I shook my head. "No, Rick." He frowned. "You stopped seeing me." He didn't answer, and for once I didn't need him to. I put my coffee in the cart and walked away, because the truth was I had spent years believing that starting over meant rebuilding everything from the ground up. It didn't. I wasn't starting from nothing. I was starting from experience, from everything I'd learned, from every mistake, every betrayal, every sacrifice. Every quiet morning, when I wondered whether I had made the right decision. The woman who walked into that gala had once been desperate for her ex-husband to realize what he'd lost. The woman who walked out didn't care anymore. That was the real victory. Not the applause, not the donors, not Rick's embarrassment, not Melissa's downfall. It was the moment I realized that my worth had never been waiting for someone else to announce it. For most of my marriage, I thought belonging meant being recognized. I thought someone important had to say my name before I could believe I mattered. But that night, when the registration attendant looked at my invitation and said, "Tell the chairman she's here," I finally understood something. You don't need someone to announce your arrival into a life you've built yourself. You don't need an ex-husband to regret leaving you. You don't need a former friend to admit she betrayed you. And you certainly don't need the people who underestimated you to suddenly become impressed. Sometimes the most powerful ending isn't watching the people who hurt you fall. It's realizing you stopped looking back before they did. So if you've ever been treated like your quietness meant weakness, if someone ever convinced you that your years of sacrifice didn't count because they couldn't be printed on a resume, or if you've ever had to rebuild yourself after someone you trusted decided you were replaceable, remember this. Starting over doesn't mean starting from nothing. Sometimes it means finally starting from everything you learned about who you are. And if you enjoy stories about family betrayal, second chances, hidden truths, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Stay with twisted family tailies. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one who has been quietly writing the ending all along.